First of all, are all of you from ANU or some of you? Oh, okay, okay. So can I just? So I'm Deep, short for Dipanshu, but you can call me Deep. And I don't know if you have any idea what we're going to be doing for the next hour and a half or so, but I'll try my best to keep you not only awake but also occupied with what seems to be relatively an important topic of discussion. It's centered largely about the functioning of the Indian economy at this time, right, which is a subject of discussion for most people, those who are economists or those who don't understand what seems to be happening, right? Sorry. So before I get started on what or why do I have such a long line written on the slide, which may mean very little to some of you in the context of talking about the economic performance of the country, if I can have just a quick round of introduction, like just your first names, and I may not remember all of them, of course, at the time of the session, but it's good to just know how many of you are from. I'm not quite sure if all of you are law school students or there is a mixed bag of like some of you are from a policy focused background, right? So if you could just have some of you or most of you starting with your introductions. And how long has it been for you guys here? It's been a week, 5 days. How's it been so far? Good, great, hectic, right? Yeah, very tight, right? So I didn't get a chance to look at your schedule, but I did with the Murdoch, and because we had 2 sessions with them. I had 2 sessions with them the day before, so it's a pretty packed schedule. I don't think I'll be able to cover the second topic that I discussed with them. That was a study that me and a group of people did at the center here on studying some of the local markets in the city of Delhi. And one of the requests that Sean had were to discuss that, because most of you are visiting Delhi in between, right, during your schedules, and you would be at some point of time shopping. So it's nice to know about what is that we did, and at the same time understand how the market systems work, how the role of bargaining, for example, happens between 2 people, right? Most of that. So that's something which we discussed. I'm not doing that now, but we can probably have a brief discussion if there's time. All right, so if we can just start with you, just your first name and Tess?
Yeah.
Are you from ANU or?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm Danielle, and I'm from UNSW.
Naomi, and I'm from UNSW.
Jacob from ANU. Liam from UNSW.
Sarah from USW.
Jackie from AIM.
Jackie, yeah.
Ragini from USW.
Jessica from UNSW.
Angie from USW.
Simon from UNSW.
Miki from ANU. Michelle from ANU. Lucy from ANU. Ray from ANU.
ANU.
Oh, UNSW.
It's almost like a verbal musical chair. Verbal round. So there's a pattern that emerges and you just. The intermingling of the subconscious and the conscious mind sometimes.
I'm Hector from UNSW.
Kira from ANU.
Alright, that's great. So it's good to start on a positive note and talking about a subject which a lot of people seem to find it, I mean, unfortunately complicated to understand, because somehow not the discipline, economics as a discipline was never classically seen to be a complicated subject in order to understand. It was largely most about, had to do with allocation of very scarce resources of what we called in satisfaction of human wants, and that's what largely people wanted to study. But somehow over the last 50 to 60 years, there has been a lot of narrowing down that has happened within the fields, whether in areas of financial economics or labor economics or industrial economics, as a result of which the method of study seems to have used mathematical modeling quite intensively as a language of communication. So I'm not using mathematics, or I'm not referring to mathematics as a way in which you can measure things. You can measure things through a lot of different ways. When you say ANU is, this is not my judgment, I'm just making a statement, hypothetical, right? ANU is a better college than UNSW, all right? Then somebody makes a statement. Somebody makes a statement. Somebody makes a statement. And so, no, I think the question would be, well, when you say better, what do you mean? Better in what respect? Say, well, maybe if the idea of measurement seems to be the area of the campus, let's say, okay? So in that case, you can say, well, you not use the word better, you'd use the words larger as a campus, right? But what are you doing in the process? You're comparing two colleges, right? Or campuses, and you're trying to compare them, where you're trying to talk about one of them in relation to the other, right? And that's actually maths. I mean, that's something which we use as some ranking, or how you rank people, that one person seems to be better and performing better. So mathematics is not only about integration and derivatives, right? There's a lot that goes into the process, and somehow a lot that went into comparison between the satisfaction of human wants and the relative satisfaction of those saw a different line of trajectory in terms of how economists, and this is, I mean, I can go back in the past, but briefly 1930s was an important decade for economists as well, because in the global economy, very similar to what we saw in the last decade or so, post the US financial crisis in 2007 and 8, there was a slide to protectionist tendencies for countries to not engage in international trade, restrict movement of money from one country to the other, right? Back in the 30s, there was a similar conundrum in the aftermath of what? Any idea what happened around Great Depression. So that too had a significant impact in countries in Europe and elsewhere. So economists that time were under the conundrum of what is that we can do as an individual that can be seen truly as path breaking, right? And somehow most of the economists around the time, when I'm talking about most of the economists, I'm largely looking at, let's say, not economists in North America, because US was predominantly the stronger nation in terms of its military might or its political say, took inspiration from physicists, where somehow the idea was, as physicists, and I don't know if you go back in a bit of the reading of the history, that time one of the most popular figures in the world was Albert Einstein, right? At the time of his travels country to country. So there was an idea that how can we use models that physicists use, for example, in depicting what's the relationship between, let's say, natural factors of movement into the functioning of the economy as a whole. And somehow, since then, the understanding has been, if you have to look and understand the functioning of the economy, you have to understand X, Y, Z mathematical coordinates to be able to understand. So the idea first, at least in the first 15 minutes or so, for me was to not look at the construction of mathematics as a language to talk about an economy, right? So I am going to talk about a bit of what indicators are important for us to understand and monitor, but indicators are just reflective points, right? It may not give you a wholesome, comprehensive idea of how the economy is functioning. That's one. The second is, so what is the language that you may use then, right? So one may then ask the question, well, economics is not only the discipline which has some kind of focus on how societies work, right? Because human beings stay in groups, right? So if societies are important, what are the other areas that you feel, or scholarships that tend to look at the functioning of societies as a whole, or individuals within societies? Can you think of any other fields, barring economics? Something we call in aggregate as social sciences, right? There's a whole debate between why we call them as social sciences and not social studies. In the US, there's a whole debate, and this still goes on. A lot of people don't still conquer that political science is actually a science. So maybe it's political prudence, right? we don't actually know why we call it political science. Well, because there is a lot of mathematization that's happened in areas like public choice theory, for example, something that happened from the 1950s by the work of an economist called Kenneth Arrow. And a lot of political scientists said, well, this is exciting stuff, because his work, or Arrow's work, was on how elections happen, how voting preferences are shaped. So political scientists said, well, this is something, this is good stuff, we should learn this and apply it. And that's how there was this whole transition from political studies or political prudence to, there's a brilliant paper by Machiavelli on how the idea of prudence plays with science. Prudence is something which you're learning from lessons from the past to be able to implement that now. I think most of the time you're seeing the commentaries that you're reading, right, from New York Times to almost any other newspaper, they're just acting prudently on what's happened in the past, and there's certain patterns they're trying to study, right? There's not much of scientific modeling. It's not like gravity, right? What's happening in the US may work really well in Iran, right? What may work well in Iran may really work well in Syria. There's a completely different analogy there. So that's also a subject of consideration, but we'll not get into it. What about from economics? Do you feel are areas that are important? Can you just close that door? Any other field apart from economics you feel that is important? No? Or just, or within social sciences? Sociology. So that's something that has to do with societies, largely working on group behavior, right? Okay. Anthropology. Anthropology may look at both groups and people within the groups, right? Yeah. So sociology, anthropology, demography, yeah.
International affairs and politics.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So let me put it this way as political science, right? Okay. Fine. Anything else? Nothing. What about psychology? Yeah. History, humanities, and social science. A lot of methods of historical analysis are also used in how, for example, you would study psychology and sociology. In psychology, in terms of the method of assessment, the psychology is the methods that are conceptualized as a body of knowledge, while psychiatry is the application of those methods, right? I think that part is clear. So in psychiatry, you see very often, one often wants to try gauge the person that you're speaking to in establishing a historical understanding of that person. Most often take it back to the childhood instances or experiences, right? So there are methodological inferences that these borrow, right? Okay. Now, what do these areas have in common? If we say anthropology, right, or sociology or history, what is that you use as a subject of your analysis, which is really important for you to establish? A closer hint is that one of the words representing that is on the slide that's in front of you. So if you go in anthropology, that's what you want to study. In anthropology, if I have spent 15 years staying in Sonipat, and I have worked very closely with communities residing here, I have a reasonably good idea of how people interact, right? While if I go to Delhi and I pass my inferences on saying that this is how people interact everywhere across the world, people say, no, that's not true. In Delhi, the level of interaction is very different because people are coming from all over the country. There's in fact no idea of the native that belongs in Delhi as a city. You can call someone as a Delhiite. That's more of a geographical positioning, not as someone who's coming in Shindivan. But here you can track that, right? So what is that is narratives. Okay. So narratives become important. The narrative of what you can shape right here is very different from the narrative that you learned there, right? That's true. One. Second, what about history? Does history as a discipline, has a taste for narratives? Yeah. It's primarily about stories, individual stories, stories of groups, stories of countries, whatever, right? So if I just throw you a chart, and this is giving you an idea of, I hope most of you know JSTOR, right? right? JSTOR is this database from where you can extract research papers from different areas, primarily in humanities and social sciences. Yeah. If you just search or by the field of articles that have been published in various areas in each discipline, which disciplines do you find most often use the word narrative, as we were just discussing? You see, it's history and anthropology, right? And when you see history and anthropology being two of the disciplines, you're not surprised. You're saying, well, that's how we learn about various narratives. Which is the least in which you see narratives are used in any context? Finance. Does that make sense? No. But why in finance do you not use the word narrative that much? Because financial analysis is not about how things are different in London from how things are different in New York. Money is moving all across and it transcends borders somehow. But one may also question, but that's not true. Money as an idea may be fluid, right? Or the need of the value of the money may be, but the shape in which money flows, right, is something which is different. It could be in the form of a digital virtual currency these days, which is so popularly being discussed in the Bitcoin movement, or whatever you may call as a period of time where money has taken different shapes. So one can use just a plastic card and get or have a transaction. That's your debit card or credit card, right? So money takes different form. At the same time, it is in denominations of different geographical positionings, right? So the money or the form of money in India is very different from where are you coming from, right? So you have $1 Australian pegged somewhere around 45, 46, 42 or 43, I don't know how many now. 50. Oh wow, it's appreciated. So 48 to 50 is what seems to be the rate, right? So most modeling in which you would use or how finance would move will depend on some form of universalized techniques of models, right? And most people working in the stock market would not want to look at narratives of London Stock Exchange and the others, right? Which is the other field that you see has the least taste for narratives, economics, right? So finance and economics seem to be the two areas where the narrowing down of these two disciplines have somehow been. But that's not how economics evolved. If you look at the classic works of anyone from David Hume to Adam Smith to David Ricardo, they're actually all talking about specific contexts, right? And specific people and groups. And in most cases, if you read, for example, just a text, not the Inquiry of Wealth of Nations, because that's most oftenly what comes to people's mind when people say Adam Smith. One of the texts he wrote much before that was Theory of Moral Sentiments, right? In the Theory of Moral Sentiments, his actually take is on human behavior and what guides people to act in a either self-interesting, maximizing manner, but not always. In fact, the entire thesis of the book is based on what kind of virtues you would want to inculcate to not be self-interest maximizing. So that's talking about the role of altruism, right? And that's been a major question that has come about to a lot of people. So when you take a car from here and you're going to a closest traffic signal, and if I club two kinds of people interpreting the event, there's a human being who would look at you and observe a certain action that you're about to take, and there's an economist, right? So I'm not that the economists are not human beings, I'm saying, but they have a different way of process of thinking, right? I'm one, so I'm coming from the economics field, so I'm more. So if you go on a traffic signal and there is a group of children coming in front of you and asking and begging for money, right? The natural urge that comes in front of you is to be able to see the condition of a person and be able to help, right? Or at the same time reflect on, oh no, I should not do that because somebody told me that I should not be giving out money. But let's say in this situation, you take out a 100 rupee note and you give it to a child that you just see. Now, what does this behavior reflect? To a human being, sitting, or a person like a third person seeing that would say that, well, you became what? Sympathetic to the person's condition or way, and tried to offer money in that. But how would an economist look at it? In fact, economist's interpretation will be that 100 rupee that you've given somehow is trying to maximize your self-interest. Because otherwise, if that self-interest maximizing behavior is not a part of this transaction that you've taken unilaterally, because it's nothing that you've received in return from the child, then you are not a rational being. So there's a tendency of what you would call as being irrational by trying to be able to help someone out of a certain action. That's the whole premise of what we call as rational choice theory, right? So I don't know if you, so how many of you have had economics at some point of time in school or wherever, at whatever point? Even if you've not, in the first chapter of what you study in micro, when we study demand and supply, right? Like how demand works or how supply of a particular product comes about, one of the basic assumptions of the law of demand or any model is that all human beings are rational. And the word rational there seems to be explained by a self-interest maximizing tendency. And that has been under severe criticism over the last few decades or so. But that apart, so the act of trying to help someone or showing an act of sympathy or compassion would be deemed irrational according to this framework. But that's not it.
But when you hand over the money, you in yourself feel a sense of self-satisfaction.
Yeah,
so it's not so much that you're receiving something from them, but you're nevertheless generating some, I wouldn't say, just this satisfaction in yourself for what you've done. So maybe it is a rational move because you are getting something in return. You're getting this feeling of being good.
So the more you give, the more you would be satisfied? Let me put it this way. So if you give 100 rupees and you see that the person is in abject mode and you want to help more. So maybe let's say you just had 100 rupees, but next time you see you have 200 rupees and you make the same payment, right? Third time you go and you do the same. Let's say in this case, and if I'm trying to track your utility, or in other words, your satisfaction level, and it's moving like this, right? That in itself fundamentally defeats the functioning of how satisfaction curves happen, because there's a law of what we call as a diminishing marginal utility. If you're doing the same action again and again, over a time period, your level of satisfaction is likely to drop. If that's not happening, then there's something seriously wrong, right? And that may not be the case. People naturally may be sympathetic. But what about someone just doing it as an act of, has nothing to do with what I feel, but that's something which I naturally do. You see someone falling down, right? Just somebody is walking past and just collapses and starts probably bleeding. There's nothing that the action of you going to go and help someone is likely to have in your own domain a self-interest maximizing principle. Though a lot of RCT theorists, in fact, have talked about that, yes, there is some behavioral satisfaction level you get by being able to help someone.
But the action of not helping, on the other hand, would be detrimental to this sense of self-satisfaction. So thus, if you did proceed to help them, if you didn't proceed to help them, you'd be almost losing something, because you think to yourself, oh my God, I've left this person stranded on the ground with a broken ankle.
Does that happen? I think if you just one day, on the day that you don't have a class, probably after 12 o'clock, you take a walk around Delhi and see how many people stop by when there are people falling by. Or let's say your experience whenever that would happen in the metro station. It's a very good example. And actually, too often, how in the metro station at a time when you go, and especially in the peak rush hours, in fact, people are trampling over the other. And there's a competitive behavior to be able to get, which is my own action is ignorant of the ability of the other person to actually get the same thing. So the act of cooperation completely subsides. And that's something which a lot of, if you read someone like Richard Dawkins and most of the people who are evolution theorists, right, or Charles Darwin's work, there is a natural sense of competition that prevails in the action of a human being. So there's nothing wrong in being able to do that. Or human beings have a natural tendency to be reason, right? So what I'm trying to argue, sorry, Vishaka, your point here.
Yeah. I was just saying, well, it's not really economics, but just in that
narrative thing. Isn't it because because in Delhi people are kind of like desensitized because if they see a person fall, just because they see it so often, or like, do you know what I mean? Like if you see a beggar on the street, you see it so often that you don't do anything about it, as opposed to like when you you come here from another.
Yeah, I'll not club that as probably a Delhi feature. It's even one may see it may be stretched to even a metropolis thing. I mean, I have seen, for example, in London, in Sydney as well. I mean, in fact, if you've seen peak hours, people are not very much considerate about the fact. Probably you'd have to be a demographist to be able to understand it has a direct relation with the number of people staying. Yes, that's true that in a Scandinavian country where people are it's sparsely populated, you may, at the same turn that you're taking almost every day, you may see the same person coming at the same time, and there's a natural sense of belonging that happens because you're quite socially isolated, and there's a natural tendency to help other people. But that's a different subject of discussion. I'm trying to just bring out the idea that while it's important for us to be able to understand how human behavior functions in being able to satisfy human wants, when resources, as the way we call it, are tangentially scarce, the behavior of human beings in a particular group or as an individual cannot be generalized in any language or method, right? And that's why the need of narratives becomes important to be able to use that as a method of study. That's how I wanted to start, probably by saying that when we talk about, for example, today, India, I'm not talking about India as one homogeneous identity of sorts. In fact, the idea of what we call today as India as a territorial space is a product of a colonial extraction, right? I think that's most of what you would know, right? Before 1947, parts of what you would call as Pakistan today or Bangladesh would be seen is in one light itself. So most or a large predominant part of South Asia was India, right? Some of the boundaries don't even have much of a geographical or, in other words, cultural segregation. So why people have been, if you go to the Indo-Bhutan border, for example, why is that there is a border right in the middle of a street where there is a village half here and half there? You don't understand any logic, right? It just seems that it's a map carved out of nowhere. So it's important to understand that India can be seen as a narrative of its own, and within the country's narrative, and if I'm using the word narrative here as an entity which may be in the form of an individual, like a human being, a group, or a country as a whole, right? And its own story becomes quite different from how, for example, other stories have evolved. There is no way in which, for example, you can compare how India's growth story can be brought about to what China has seen in the last 20 to 30 years. Some of the challenges may be similar in nature and the problems may come across as the same, but it's extremely difficult to be able to generalize and say, well, this is exactly what these two countries can do. And these are the often inferences drawn upon in most analysis that you see. This is what India can learn from China. This is what China can learn from India. This is what India can learn from Australia. This is what Australia can learn from India, right? All these inferences drawn, and I think the idea here seems to be that you have to look at each of them as a narrative of its own. In fact, within India, you'll not see one common narrative in any point of time. When you are in the city of Delhi, if you take that as your experience of India, that defeats the very purpose of your visit, for example. You would definitely want to make a visit. I usually say to most of my friends visiting abroad, visit at least 10 cities, right? And that's when you can only understand tangentially to a 5 to 10% scale that this is what the country looks like. Cities will also give you an aggregation of different people coming from different cultural backgrounds. But having said that, let me move on. So the role of narratives, I hope this point seems to be clear, that narratives become an important way of how we understand stories of not only individuals in cases of history or anthropology, but there's a lot that we can do by involving that in the field of analysis in economic theory, right? I'll quickly sum up some of the perspectives that you can get, because one should not get an idea that, well, why are you talking about narratives so much? I'm talking about narratives here because if you have a given policy, right, that's conceptualized by a political party or by a discussion process in the parliament, the implementation of a particular law, which translates then into a government policy, has an impact on people. I guess most of us would agree to that. No? Policies do have an impact on people or no? Sometimes, maybe. Yes? No? Okay. So some policies may not directly impact, but may have an indirect impact in terms of how. So a useful analogy here seems to be when you talk about tax, for example. Tax may have a direct impact on an individual's income. I may be paying tax out of the income I'm earning right here, and I may be bearing that in the form of what we call as a direct tax, right? Income tax then classifies as a direct tax, where the burden of the tax is on the individual, right? At the same time, there may be a tax that may be imposed on what I buy. I bought this bottle and I had to pay, let's say, 100 rupees. And while that's not the cost of production, I believe, right? Do you think that the cost of production of this would be like 100 rupees, 100 US dollars, let's say, right? So this is 100 US dollars. The cost of production may not be that much. Maybe let's say $10 or whatever. But what I'm paying right here is not the cost of production. It has some profit margin added at different levels. But more importantly, it also has a tax amount calculated as a percentage on the price of the product. We may call this a sales tax or VAT or whatever. But the nature of this tax seems to be indirect in nature, right? In other words, the person who buys this bottle would have to pay for it, right? Now, why is that important? Because if I am buying this bottle for $100 and let's say you are buying this bottle for $100, both of us have a different income threshold. And let's say a third person is buying this bottle for $100 with the least amount of income, all three of us are paying the same amount of tax. Yes or no? Right? So both direct and indirect tax, or indirect tax in the way in which you're paying it on the product itself, can be deemed what we call as regressive in nature. That means that regardless of the income of the individual, everyone is paying the same amount. Right? In India's context, it's 65%. Most of the tax burden is indirect in nature. So that means a person who is from the lowest strata of the income class is paying the same tax, right, on a diagnostic test as against the other. I'm not talking about people below poverty line. A lot of people above poverty line who are also poor, right? That's the whole issue, right? The second seems to be that in a direct tax, you have a direct burden. So now as a policy, if you're making changes in the tax system, it has an impact on people in a direct capacity or an indirect capacity. And that's where use of narratives in the method of assessment of a given policy may provide us with different perspectives, right? The first perspective may be seen as a humanist perspective, which is basically on how these individual stakeholders are being affected by it. If I have increased my indirect tax, why I'm using the word tax or why I'm using the reference to indirect tax? Because right now that seems to be the major subject of discussion in India because of one tax that was imposed. Any idea, Goods and services tax, right? It's the GST. It's an indirect tax on all goods to try homogenize the tax structure, right, across states. Now, the idea seems to be if you have a taxed product earlier, which was for 5%, now GST is imposed. Now you have to pay 12% on the same product. Well, I can do that. I don't mind the 7% extra charge, but the person next to me has not had an increased jump in income over the last 5 years. As a result, he or she is bearing a burden at larger levels. So the humanist perspective gives you on how individual stakeholders are being affected, right, as a result of the implementation of a given policy. The second can be seen as the contextual perspective. That the context is built in different social, cultural, and political environments, right? When I say social environment, the social environment here is extremely different from what you would see down south or down east or west. In India's sociology, and that's something which is, it's a sociology class lesson, but class is the least identified variable of hierarchical segregation. Would you understand that? What I meant? Class is seen to be the least identified element of social segregation. When I say that, what do I mean? The notion of class, right?
Is it like the least considered aspect? So
Yeah.
when you put someone in a social hierarchy, you consider their class.
Yeah, so usually in class, what do you use? Income earned, wealth that you've accumulated, most of things like that. So what do you think in India is major? Caste. Oh wow, it's everybody. Okay, caste is an important factor, but is caste the only factor in India's case?
Like social hierarchy.
Yeah, I'm saying in social hierarchy as well.
You say gender?
Gender?
Gender.
Gender is a very important part, right? Okay.
I reckon like your socioeconomic status is pretty big,
Yeah.
especially in like 21st century India. No? Okay.
No, I'm facial expressions have nothing to do with my response. I can just have clueless expressions all day long. No, but I'm just saying, okay, is class is one, let's say, in some cases. In Delhi, class is definitely a big factor. You have to go to the southern part of Delhi to be able to understand. So class is a big factor. So that's one. Second, you have to look at, so caste is one, gender you said is one. What are the others? And that's why I said, when you say India, it's not only India as one.
Is
Right.
religion one? Does that matter?
Religion in terms of social hierarchy, not really. I mean, there are different ways or sects that we call them within religion. So sects is sects, right? So sects would be the way in which you can see different religions have. I'll not use that as a segregate. What else? No?
Education?
No. Yeah, occupation is directly correlational to these variables. That segregation is happening largely at that level. In fact, a lot of sociologists have argued that occupation is used in parts of Eastern Europe. So a lot of that scholarship has come by. Okay, give me a hint. Geographically, this is positioned in the eastern part of the country, where the issue of caste is not a big problem. The issue of caste is not a big problem. Eastern part. When I say eastern part, which cities can you think of? Assam? Okay. Yeah, that's Assam. All right. So where in Assam, or the conflict that you've seen in Assam that emerged, because in the 90s there were increased militancy in the northern part there, right? I don't know if you know about it, but if you just write conflict in Assam and do some research, there's a lot of strong militant activities. The nature of the conflict, in the very nature of how it evolved, was not looking at variables of caste or class alone. It was largely tribes. So ethnicity became a major factor of segregation. When I say ethnicity, then ethnic tribes coming from different backgrounds were in a constitutive conflict. So context becomes very important. If I'm implementing a given policy in, let's say, parts of Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Sikkim, when I'm talking about Nagaland, most original Naga tribes have migrated way back to Southeast Asia to include spaces of Cambodia and Vietnam. And I don't know if you know a little bit about history, most of the Naga kings traveled down there to Cambodia. You know, in a country like Cambodia, which is in Southeast Asia, close to Laos and Vietnam, there's a lot of Hindu practices that evolved that largely came in from the movement of Naga tribes. So what happened, everything okay? There's a lot of, yeah. So with the state that you look at and identify, the context becomes a very important part of your analysis. And there the contextual element of the social hierarchy, whether you're using caste as a variable. Well, in a state like Bihar, I would be very conscious of the caste structure, right? In a place like Punjab, I would be very sure of the class structure, not only in the caste, but class. Because there class becomes a variable of segregation on the access to land ownership, right? And this is also part of the same territory. Not Punjab, but Haryana also comes to the same thing. The third comes as behavioral perspective. Now, behavior is important because the agents who are implementing a given policy, that is your executive body, the people who are receiving the benefits of it, right? And the people implementing it, what is the behavior behind it? I may have a policy that I want to clean India and have no trash present whatsoever wherever. But I'm doing it as a part of a moral imposition on everyone, while people generally, as an individual, I may not care anything about keeping my own classroom clean, right? Now, how do you nudge people to make changes to the behavior in acting or responding to a situation? Now, a Singaporean response to that would be, well, it doesn't matter. We will impose, we don't want our streets to be dirty, and anywhere you throw a trash, you may be penalized up to, let's say, $100 or $150. Their monetary disincentives, in a way, or penalized forms work, right? So how do you induce behavioral perspectives become an important point. Last point being the agency perspective. How do you understand the word agency in the way or in the field in which you're coming from? A lawyer may interpret it in a completely different way. Economist may do it in different. You may do it in a different way. And this is perhaps the last point where I'm looking at the theoretical abstractions. Then we move to indicators and the India's narrative. Quickly.
Like autonomy?
Agency is autonomy. It reflects autonomy of an individual or an entity or anything. Okay. All right. So agency has some relation to autonomy. But what made you say that? When you say it has to do with autonomy, something must have, there must be some data accumulated in that memory that would have, no? Or it's a speculative. So autonomy, well, I'll take that, that's fine. That there is a lot of scholarship which takes agency, the notion of autonomy. But how is that you can interpret in any other alternative light? Any idea? Agency, the notion, the word agency or agent, some. Would you say agent is someone who acts on behalf of someone else? Right? Have you heard of these two terms often used together, principal agent problem? There's a principal and there's an agent, right? Principal is the chief institution. So while state may be seen as a principal, right? Government may be seen as an agent, or if government is seen as a principal, a bureaucracy or bureaucratic system may be seen as an agency, right? So agency often, in the way in which markets function, in the way firms function, or even in the legal dictionary, right? How contract laws function or evolve, is seen in a principal agent structure, right? Now, when I'm talking of principal and agent, there's someone who's acting on behalf. There, the notion of autonomy is completely dissolved because you're losing your autonomy to what the principal is saying. I have passed this law, you have to implement it. You have no say to be able to. You have to interpret it in a way and implement it, right? So the notion of autonomy becomes important as how feminist jurisprudence evolved, because that was one of the first areas of, let's say, philosophical underpinning, where role of women in extremely patriarchal systems was questioned, that you can't see them as an agency of their own. And one of the first, a lot of philosophers at that time said that, well, that's true. The notion of agency there becomes more in form of autonomy, which is independent of the principle. The principle is not needed. You don't need a man in the house to be able to implement a given structure, right? And that's one of the reasons why you see in feminist jurisprudence, the notion of agency is seen in an autonomous structure. That's why I was trying to guess if you're coming from that scholarship. But that's where autonomy is important, right? All right, so enough of the narratives. Let me move now to take case of one of the narratives that we would study, and that's of the Indian country as a whole. The question that I would be looking at, I think given the time we have, you can look at the first question, is that the nature of macroeconomic challenges that are facing the Indian economy. When we use the word macro means that that's aggregated at a national level, right? That does not mean, and I think the challenge that we're going to discuss, that does not mean that the situation on the ground at a micro level is any different, right? So we can just say that micro to macro is the scaling that we've done, right? From one household to the entire country as a whole, you can see some of the problems persist, okay? And that is the connection that you may draw. So what are the key problems that seems to be affecting the performance of the Indian economy as a whole as of right now? Or the growth narrative of India. The first seems to be the problem of looking at how the economy has grown over the last 3 to 4 decades in a manner which baffles conventional economic theory. When I say baffles conventional economic theory, we say that any country to be able to grow consistently at a rate of 7%. You know, when somebody says 7% growth, what does that mean? No? So if somebody says the GDP is growing at the rate of 7%, what does that mean?
7% of what it previously was.
Yeah, okay. But what does that represent? This country is growing at 8%. This country is growing at 9%. GDP is 10%. So GDP is gross domestic product. What does that represent?
It's like the total amount of manufacturing, import, export, or like exports minus import.
Total amount of goods produced in a given year.
Like,
So-
more or less.
See, I baked a lot of cakes in my house and ate a lot of them. Is that a part of the GDP transaction?
It's export minus import, like plus income produced. Like,
So a country that does not export or import, we can't calculate its GDP.
Isn't there any exchange within the country?
When you're talking about exchange, what kind of exchange is happening? I made some cake, you made some custard.
No, just
Or no, you made some, sorry?
just monetary exchanges.
Monetary exchange. So barter would not be a part of it. When I use the word barter, that means I am taking the pudding that you have made for the cake that I have baked. Okay? Would that be a part of a GDP transaction? That may be a part of how you may shop in Delhi. You may buy something for 100 rupees and the shopkeeper may not have the change to give you back. The person may say, I'll give you a cup. That may be some kind of barter as well. All right. So the idea seems to be only monetary exchange, right? Or all monetized transactions of produced goods in a given year are a part of the GDP calculation. We can debate on what are the calculative methods and everything. We're not looking at that. But in other words, GDP measures the monetized transactions in a country. So usually the Paul Samuelson, who's microeconomist, the joke goes about that if a rich lady marries her chauffeur, GDP goes down. Why? Because earlier the service that was being offered as a chauffeur was, let's say, of a certain amount which is monetized, and that was a part of a GDP calculation. But now that it's not a monetized transaction, it will not be a part of GDP. So I think that's one of the things that you should be clear. So if a country is growing at 7%, that means the amount of monetized transaction out of the production taking place in a country is growing out at that rate, which is considered somehow to be good for the growth of the country. If people are producing more, people are buying more, if they're buying more, they're consuming more, and there's a whole cycle, right? In India's context, or in any country, you say that that is likely to grow as your country transitions from agriculture to manufacturing and from manufacturing to services. What does that mean? If your primary sector, which is your sector providing for raw materials, is providing raw materials to industries, industries are producing more and are providing for services in exchange, right? E-commerce would be seen as a service. E-commerce is selling goods which are being produced. That's manufacturing. These goods being produced are being procured from farms. That's agriculture, right? So, or agribusiness. So the transition from primary to secondary to tertiary is what we see as a pattern of growth. In India's context, it's actually not been that way. Agricultural sector has still been quite deprived of in its performance, and we've seen a boom in the tertiary sector, which in other words means the services. They started happening largely after the 90s. So there are mismatches in the sectoral performance of the country. That's one. Second seems to be the employment scenario, and I think that's a big debate. You've been here on campus for 5 days. You've been eating food here in the mess, right? So you've been interacting with people from different spaces. I'm also an employee, of the university. The person who's recording this lecture is also an employee. The person who's serving you food is also an employee. The person who's cleaning the field, right, or keeping the grass in a particular manner is also an employee. But all of them have different contracts, right? All of them have different contracts. And each of these contracts are a part of a different system of employment structure, right? Some part of that is organized and some part of that is unorganized. The most unorganized and informal seems to be the one or the individual person who is responsible for cleaning, right? And this is, in your careful observations, when you're walking around, you'll see women who are coming in the morning and spending time till the evening watering pots and plants, right? They are on a completely third-party, unorganized contract, right? The person who's serving you food is on a third-party contract through a company called Sodexo, for example, right? That's mostly semi-formal. It's organized. They know what they're getting paid for, but it can be suspended at any point of time. There's no they're quite vulnerable as well. At the same time, I'm also on a contract, but I seem to be more part of an organized system, right? So one of the challenges that India's growth narrative has faced over the last few decades is most of the employment that has happened in the unorganized informal sector, right? We'll look at some of the numbers, but you'll see that in the challenges there. And that imposes what kind of problems may come in. So as against me and the lady or a guy who's working here and watering the plants, what is the difference if there are more jobs being created in that area as against here?